interpreting is ready. Why don't we get started? Hello, good day, everyone. We're just letting participants into the room. We'll just wait just a minute while people come into the room. Thank you. We'll get started in just 1 minute. As people are coming into the room. Thank you all for joining us. Great. Well, why don't we get started as people are coming in. Good day. I'm James Thurston. I'm a vice president here with G3 ICT, the global initiative for inclusive ICTs. And we're really happy to have each of you joining us for this discussion. And we think it will be both engaging and informative. The title of this event, of this discussion, is Adopting the Smart City Accessible ICT Public Procurement Model Policy. This is a model policy developed by the G20 Smart City Alliance. This event today is one way that G3 ICT, my organization, is recognizing Global Accessibility Awareness Day, and we're glad that you can join us for this event. We know that cities worldwide are really undergoing a rapid and significant, really, digital transformation. We also know that the way that cities are buying technology and deploying technology is in many ways making the digital divide for people with disabilities worse, not better. And so that's what the focus of this conversation is, and of the model policy that we'll be talking about for cities. Our goal with this event today is to hear from global leaders about specific strategies and about this model procurement policy for cities that cities can adopt to support greater inclusion of people with disabilities through accessible technology. So before going any further, I'd like to ask my colleague Yulia to briefly describe how we'll manage the event to optimize accessibility. Yulia?
Thank you, James. Do you see the slides?
Not yet.
Just a second.
Sure.
One more attempt.
If not, we can just talk through it.
I think it should work now. How about now?
Yes, there they are. Yep.
Perfect. So welcome everybody. My name is Yulia Sarvivo. I'm a senior project manager at G3 ICT. And we just want to walk you through some of their session practices so that our event is the most useful and convenient for all our attendees. So first of all, this meeting is recorded and it will be made available to the public and of course to all our participants. We have closed captions available in English. You can switch them on by clicking on closed captions button in the menu. Or you can also check the chat for the link. We have auto-translated captions available in French, German, and Spanish. We know that we do have a lot of participants from French and Spanish-speaking countries, so we hope you will find it helpful. Please check the chat for the links, and you will go to the web browser page with these auto-translated captions. We also have international sign language interpretation available. You can pin the interpreter, Carol Lee, by right-clicking on her image. We would ask the panelists to keep the microphones muted unless you are speaking. We also would like to ask panelists, if you have a question to a panelist, please use Q&A section, not the chat. And the chat you are welcome to use for any general comments, or if you have any technical issues. There is the G3 ICT team monitoring the chat, so in case there is something wrong, let us know. We will try to help. We are having the Q&A session scheduled toward the end of our today's discussion. But if there are any questions left or any comments that you would like to make after the meeting, please send them to info@smartcitiesforall.org. Thank you, James.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Julia. So today's event, this conversation is part of a larger collaboration, I would say, among a few different organizations. And I'd like to ask each of them to make some brief welcoming remarks to get us started. I'll actually start a little bit. G3ICT, my organization, is an international nonprofit organization. We were created about 16 years ago with support of the United Nations, specifically to focus on the inclusion and rights and digital inclusion of the more than 1 billion people with disabilities around the world. And we do that in a bunch of different ways, which you can see on our website. But several years ago, we launched a global initiative with partners that's really focused on inclusive cities. It's called Smart Cities for All. And it's through that initiative, Smart Cities for All, that we work directly with cities and with leading partners like the ones you'll hear about in just a second. So with that, I'm going to ask each of our partner organizations if you could introduce yourselves. And Federico, would you like to start? Federico? All right, let's go to Rushi.
Yeah, thank you, James. So hi, everyone. My name is Rushi Rama, and I'm calling from the World Economic Forum. I actually lead the G20 Global Smart Cities Alliance, and I'm really grateful for the space today to talk about the commitment that we've made to accessibility and to this agenda. Now, as you might expect, the World Economic Forum promotes inclusivity across the board. We have a huge number of initiatives in areas like financial inclusivity and jobs and skills and so on. But when it comes to cities, I probably don't need to tell you all. Cities and local services are ground zero for accessibility. And so that's why it's really important, I think, that when we talk about the city's agenda, accessibility is at the center of that. Now, the forum is very good at producing frameworks and high-level dialogues. In fact, next week is our annual meeting. But I'm excited about this work in particular because it goes past that. It goes to the practicalities of how we make a difference. And so, that's really what the G20 Global Smart Cities Alliance was founded to do. It was intended to create those, or not even create, but compile those foundational ethical policies that would underpin, a smart city, or even just any city that wants to deploy technology, that wants to do so in a sustainable, ethical way that respects its citizens and respects, the sustainability of what it's trying to do. So we can dig into some of that a little bit later, and when we look at the policy more depth and when we have a panel discussion. But that's really why I'm fully supporting, what James and partners are trying to do with this effort here and the purpose of this webinar.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rushi. We really enjoy, but also benefit from this collaboration with the G20 Smart City Alliance and the World Economic Forum. Laura, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, I'm Laura Ruby, and I'm with Microsoft. And we're here today because we made a decision to partner with the forum and G20 and to support the Launchpad project because it's just such a natural fit with our mission to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. As a company, we've upped our commitment to create and open doors to bigger opportunities for the more than 1 billion people with disabilities worldwide. And the work that we're sharing with you today is just one way that we're doing that. For us, creating inclusive economic opportunities for everyone means removing barriers to workforce entry, creating cultures of inclusion within workforces and societies, and increasing access to digital technology for everyone. We're here today because we know that cities have a very specific and significant role to play in improving societal inclusion for people with disabilities. And we know from our experience and from the work of leading cities like Los Angeles that inclusive digital technology can bridge the barriers to communication, interaction, and information. So I really want to applaud the work of G3ICT, the World Economic Forum, and G20, as you all partner with the cities worldwide to adopt the model policy and to include accessibility and procurement policy. So this is really an incredibly powerful way for cities to leverage accessible technology and to increase inclusion for everyone. Thank you.
Laura, thank you very much. And a little bit later in the discussion here, we'll be talking about an initiative called the Inclusive Procurement Launchpad. That's a way that G3ICT, our nonprofit, is working with cities around the world, including a couple that you'll hear from in just a moment. Microsoft has been very generous in supporting our work in bringing this model, this G20 model policy to cities around the world. So thank you also, Laura and Microsoft, for that support to our organization. I believe we have Federico back now.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we do, Federico.
Yeah, sorry. Hello, everyone. I'm here in Kisumu, Kenya for the Upper Cities. So we're having a little bit of a rainstorm and internet not working so well. But I'm here from United Cities and Local Governments. I'm the Accessibility Policy Officer here. And just for a short, United Cities and Local Governments is the largest network of cities, local and regional governments. And we represent their voices both with dialogues between other municipalities and at the UN. And in terms of this particular webinar, it's very important to what we've been promoting both within our policies around accessibility and universal design and also digitalization. We have two communities of practice, one on digital cities and accessibility, both which connect on issues that are transversal and are also part of the Coalition of Digital Rights. And one thing, and I'm sure all of you that are working so well, is one of the really influential ways that cities can be involved in equity and promoting human rights is the way that their procurement policies are led. And since we are working so much on the localization of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, along with other frameworks, including the WHO's Age-Friendly Cities Framework and Communities, we want to ensure that not only the commitments are there, but also what we're doing at the local level really resonates with all our citizens and residents, particularly those who are normally marginalized and put on the outside of society. And if we've seen anything from the COVID pandemic, just that digital divide is even wider than we thought. So just in short, I'm looking forward to the dialogue, but this is why we're here. And we're definitely hoping that members of the community of practice, but also our broader membership can be involved in the future pilots.
Great, thank you so much, Federico, and thank you for partnering on this event and all the work that you do, focusing the attention of cities around the world on accessibility and inclusion of people with disabilities. So with that, and we'll hear from Laura, Federico, and Rushi a bit later as well. But let's get started. And I think it's really important to start with cities and actual city perspectives. And so we're going to pull in a few cities here to give us some remarks and answer some questions. A colleague and a friend of mine says that cities are where people live, work, and play. Increasingly, we are becoming a global urban community. Our world is rapidly urbanizing, and what cities do is critically important, including how they buy and deploy technology. So today, we are really fortunate to have with us leaders from 3 cities. They are partners with G3ICT and are committed to using procurement to promote greater inclusion by adopting this G20 model policy for procurement of accessible technology that we'll be talking about in much more detail in a bit. G3ICT is working with these 3 cities to adopt the policy. The cities are Los Angeles, Istanbul, and Quito, so geographically diverse. And with us today, we have from those cities, Stephen David Simon. He is the Executive Director for the Department on Disability with the City of Los Angeles. We have Borsu Özdemir. She's the Smart City Director for Istanbul. And we have Ricardo Alberto Pozo Urquizo. He is the Secretary of Mobility for the City of Quito. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for being partners. And let's jump right in. And Borsu, maybe we can start with you and maybe just speak a little bit about, from the perspective of Istanbul, why you think it's important for Istanbul to look at and adopt this G20 model procurement policy?
Thank you, James. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Istanbul has a population more than 60 million people. It means that bigger than 38 countries. Exactly, is really important pilot cities for ICT accessibility. Actually, Article 7 of the Turkish Disability Act number 5378 specifically states that information and communication technologies must be accessible for the disabled. The Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality mission statement specifically calls for the provision of accessible services. The Smart City Department has taken this mission to heart. Our product development process includes accessibility as a design requirement, and we have our products tested for accessibility prior to launch. Being a smart city requires meeting the needs of all of our citizens, in other words, being inclusive. As a department with primary responsibility for ICT within the Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality, we are also the department most aware of the challenge that this presents. We conduct a digital divide study, a critical step in becoming a genuinely smart city encompassing all of Istanbul. We saw that the digital divide takes many forms: the economic divide, the gender divide, the knowledge and skills divide, and the accessible divides. Just as there are many forms of digital divide, there are also many ways to address this, address the challenges it represents. Internally, we look to innovation in product development. From an organizational standpoint, integrating accessibility into our process is critical. Codifying accessibility criteria into our information and communication technologies procurement process will ensure the availability of affordable and accessible digital services for people with disabilities. I guess it is a very short, brief information what we are doing, how is going on with us. Yeah.
Borsa, thank you so much. And I think it's one of the things that really impressed our team and our partners with the work of Istanbul as part of the G20 Smart City Alliance is your recognition, which you mentioned about the legal requirements you already have as a city to focus on inclusion and accessibility. Your already deep understanding about what the digital divide in Istanbul looks like. And then also, I think the recognition that policies like this procurement model policy can really help impact and improve the situation with some of those divides. So we technically have not announced that Istanbul and Quito will be the next two cities that we're working with on the model policy, but we're thrilled to get started working with you in Istanbul. Thank you, Borsu.
Exactly, thank you.
Sure. Stephen, before I ask you about process, I want to just check in with you about sort of the why. Los Angeles was the first city that we worked with as part of the Launchpad project to adopt this model policy for procurement. Can you say a little bit, Stephen, about why that was important to you? I know you were sort of immediately interested and really worked to get others in city departments involved, but what did you and some of your colleagues in the city see in this kind of a model policy that was important? Stephen, we're not hearing you, Stephen. Stephen, for me, you're on mute. Oh, there you go. Oh, I think we got you. Stephen? While we wait for
trying again.
Okay, we got you, Stephen.
Good morning from Los Angeles. Sorry about that, folks. See what happens with technology sometimes. You know, obviously, yes, Los Angeles has been very invested in this process, and so glad to have partnered with the folks at G3 ICT. You know, like my colleague from Istanbul was saying, I mean, first and foremost on the front end, of course, is the access and inclusion for people with disabilities. It can't be an afterthought. It has to be integrated, literally, I would argue, into everything we do as a city. And this digital divide has gotten much worse here, certainly through the COVID pandemic. So, of course, there's the compliance end, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Rehabilitation Act, and so on. But also, our compliance is easier if the products we purchase and deploy are accessible in the first place, and we don't have to sort of come back when someone challenges it because they don't have access. And this isn't really just for constituents, for the community to have access to civic engagement. It's also a really big improvement, at least opportunity for productivity for employees with disabilities as well, and gives us a stronger workforce. And then I'd add also something I think people don't think about as much. The back end of this is risk management, right? Failure to comply regarding accessibility really comes at a huge cost. And in the U.S., enforcement of federal accessibility laws are generally designed to be fought through the civil legal system. And we've had lawsuits on emergency management, response, housing, sidewalks. And what they all have in common, actually, is that the settlements required accessible communications, constituent access to information, accessing and tracking data. And again, by doing this proactively, I think literally there's a taxpayer cost savings for a city that becomes more effective in a truly smart city.
Thank you for that, Stephen, and for a couple of things, raising the point and making clear that when cities are buying technology that's accessible and deploying that accessible technology, the benefits obviously go to people living in the city or tourists in the city, but also to your city employees. And all of your cities employ people with disabilities. And so making sure that the technology works for them is also important. And I'm glad that you also raised one of the drivers, I guess I would say, for cities wanting to be more inclusive when it comes to their technology, which is legal compliance issues. Obviously, there are other important drivers for commitment to inclusion. I think compliance and risk management have to be on the radar screen for cities as well as they think about the kinds of technology they're purchasing. We'll come back to you in a minute, Stephen, about process. But Ricardo, Quito is also one of the next cities that we'll be working with on adopting this G20 model policy. Can you talk a little bit about why it was important for Quito to look at this model policy and adopt the model policy for procurement?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm Agustina Santana. I'm representing Ricardo this morning. He is excusing his participation. He's in another meeting right now. But I'm representing him and the Secretariat of Mobility from the municipality of Quito. And adopting accessible information technology and communication procurement policies guarantees that our institutions who contract services for public use include in their processes intuitive technologies that assure the equal right for all citizens, especially people with disabilities, to interact with the public space and the public services that the city can offer through their different platforms. So currently Quito is working on the implementation of technologies to achieve better levels of operation in mobility, in collecting big data for environment, security, territorial planning. So these are our priorities as a municipality and as the Secretary of Mobility. So this is very important for us to have these tools for procurement policies.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you for stepping in for Ricardo. We appreciate that. And as with Istanbul, we haven't formally announced that we'll be working with Quito to adopt the model policy like we did with Los Angeles, but that announcement will be coming very soon, and we're looking forward to it. I think one of the interesting and important ways that Quito is coming to this model policy is with the mobility department, the secretary in the lead. We know transportation and mobility departments in cities around the world are enormous consumers of technology and users of technology. And so having that department in one of the lead positions in Quito, I think will be incredibly effective as we work with the city on understanding and then adopting the model policy for procurement. Thank you. Stephen, if I could come back to you as the first city that we've worked with on adopting this model policy. Los Angeles finished the process not too long ago. And basically our G3ICT team worked with people in your city over a couple months in a series of 5 or 6 different working meetings. But could you talk a little bit about, Stephen, the actual process in Los Angeles of who was involved in understanding the policy, who was involved in discussions about maybe tweaking the model policy a bit, and what were some of the key steps involved from your perspective? Thinking about other cities who are actually attending today, and they might be interested in hearing how you went about actually working with the model policy.
And it's funny, James, you say we finished the process, and we're thinking we've barely just started. Of course, the drafting and really tailoring the policy to the city was what we've spent the last several months on. I think our success in getting to where we are, which is, we're close to formal adoption of the policy. It's a city council action. It's probably an announcement from the mayor. All those pieces are still in process, and then the trainings that departments need to actually implement. But I think, again, our success was sort of from the high-level response we started with. We had leadership from the mayor's office of neighborhood services. Our deputy mayor, Mary Hodge, championed this. We co-chaired the effort with the city's chief procurement officer and her team, and then my folks at the Department on Disability. We engaged key departments that played sort of specialized roles, like the Information Technology Agency, Public Works, Contract Management, General Services. They're folks who either do some procurement for other departments or buy at an extraordinarily large scale, or again, deal with technology on a daily basis. But we also engaged other large departments, transportation, recreation, and parks, who do a lot of procurement, and they model different types of needs for procurement. They may be buying technology to make sure families can register their kids for an adaptive recreation program. Well, that technology needs to be accessible, right? They may be purchasing new buses and physical equipment, but again, the technology around it again has to be accessible. And so just explaining to departments the importance of this was a key up front. Now what's funny is, if you recall some of the pushback we got, I think our first two trainings were built around why access and inclusion for people with disabilities was so important. And we got pushback not because folks disagreed with that. We got pushback because they said, we entirely agree with that. We just need to know how to implement this policy. How do we change our procurement? What do we need to do? Because, and that was very exciting for me as the head of the Department on Disability. So moving to best practices and moving to implementation, I think, is going to be at the heart of any other city really implementing the policy. What is it the person that actually drafts the contracts needs to know to move forward? And then I think what extends from that is, and it's a gap that we recognize we have here, is making sure departments understand how to determine whether the technology they're purchasing is accessible, right? That's a skill set that is actually, at a high level, and I don't know that a lot of folks recognize that. So we will probably have to change some staffing categories in the city. We'll probably have to do some hiring to make sure that we have people who can read a VPAT, a voluntary product accessibility template, or otherwise be able to really engage that the city is getting what it asks for in purchases. And then my other footnote to that in process is, we engaged the city attorney's office and others to also make sure that we have a good process when vendors are trying to sell a city a product that simply isn't accessible, or something that the city gets challenged because our employees can't use it or the community can't use it. We have to have a really great process to either get a replacement product or, again, ideally make sure we don't purchase something inaccessible in the first place. And I think this model policy gets us to a place where we can do that.
Thank you for that, Stephen. And I think from our perspective in working with you, the first city that we will have worked with closely on understanding and adopting the model policy for procurement, I think our team was really impressed with the breadth of participation there across departments in Los Angeles. I think for each of the working sessions, we had at least 30 different people from different departments that included senior leaders in departments like yourself, and also managers who are on point for different issues related to technology and accessibility and inclusion. So that was really great for us to see. I think we were thrilled with the progress that you made in Los Angeles, and glad that we were able to provide some support in that. And I think it's important what you've raised too around being really sort of tactical and how do we do this? Okay, we're bought in. We know that we buy a lot of technology in Los Angeles and we want to make sure it's accessible, but how do we actually work with our procurement officials? What kind of training and skills do they need in procurement officials, but also with IT professionals it's great to see you working through those issues as well as part of the process. And maybe just finally, Stephen, I'm wondering if you could just touch on the extent to which, as part of the process there in Los Angeles, in upping its commitment to buying accessible technology, the role of the Paralympics and Olympics coming up in what seems like a long time, but I'm sure to you seems like it's not a long time away. Was that a part of the process and the thinking there?
You know, it's tomorrow. 2028 is coming really, really quickly. Yeah, yes, absolutely. I mean, our big picture, something like the Olympics and Paralympics coming to the city makes us rethink and reevaluate all of our systems on a truly grand scale. And you know, the beauty of this sort of targeted procurement piece is it lets us look at how we standardize and streamline other aspects of our procurement. It makes us you know, as we get very excited to engage newer technologies and more kiosks and ways to move people around the city en masse in ways that don't normally happen, and ways to regulate our traffic and so on. All this technology is being purchased very quickly, and making sure that the accessibility aspect of it is you know, just a key element up front and not, again, an afterthought. I'll say that a million times, is something that I think us working through this process has really helped us do. And quite frankly, a lot of the technologies that are coming into place, everything from wayfinding to, you know, to communications in places like airports. You know, a lot of that was originally designed to be an accommodation, right? And got, you know, translated into use for the general public. And so I keep thinking, if we really focus on disability and accessibility at the forefront of our big events and our day-to-day business, it's going to help really improve and streamline the work we're doing.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Stephen. And before we wrap up this part of the conversation with these three leading cities, let me just check in with Quito and Istanbul. Any last thoughts or remarks from either of you in Quito or Istanbul?
Yes, I can say that we are really, really, I mean, appreciate the part of this policy statement and policy study with you, because right now the high topic for us, digital inclusiveness, is quite important, because the public services environment is changed. It was in the physical world. Right now, everything is public services in digital world. And if we want to be inclusive, and we need to get this procurement, because it's legal document. It's also forcing also other private companies, and also our organization inside, and also teaching this culture, the other department. And if we well define this procurement and this policy, it will help the people when they crash in any problem, how can they solve it? And then we are also learning from the LA experience, and also this is also a lesson learned things, because yeah, I can add this right now.
Bersu, thank you so much. And we're looking forward to starting the work with you. And I think what your remarks about technology in cities is a great segue actually to our next group of speakers and discussants, where we have several experts and leaders on cities, on smart cities, on technology, procurement, accessibility. And so for this part of the conversation, I'd like to invite in Federica, Rushi, and Laura, who you met before, and introduce themselves. And then an additional speaker, Ruth B. Yesner, who's the Vice President of Government and Smart Cities Strategies Practice at IDC. So let's transition a little bit now into what we know about cities, what we know about smart cities, inclusive smart cities. And Rushi, maybe starting with you, if you could speak a little bit about why the G20 Smart City Alliance and the World Economic Forum decided to create an accessibility and inclusion procurement policy as one of your first 5 model policies for the Smart City Alliance. I know we were really thrilled to see that commitment by the forum and by the G20, that 20% of your model policies were focused on accessibility and inclusion. Can you, Rushi, speak a little bit about the why of that?
Yeah, totally. So if you recall, you know, the G20 Global Smart Cities Alliance was commissioned to compile foundational ethical policies for smart cities for any city that wants to deploy technology. And we organized that thinking around not just accessibility and inclusivity, but all of the things we think are critical to creating a smart city program that lasts. And those are things like sustainability, interoperability, transparency, privacy. All of these things we think of as very important. But as you say, we did start with looking at accessibility and inclusivity, and that was after us doing a review of policies that we thought could be viable candidates for those initial efforts. And because we're doing this in an agile way, we've been building more and more of these policies ever since. It's not going to be a finished product. We're always going to be compiling more of these policies, but we did start with ICT accessibility in public procurement, and that was for a few different reasons, actually. The first and most obvious is the same thing that everybody on this panel or in this session said already, which is that you can't have a smart city without it being accessible, without it being inclusive, and it needs to be built in. So it's obviously crucial to having an ethical smart city. But secondly, the policy, which as you say, G3ICT had already done a lot of work on, it has the benefit of being practical and well defined. So unlike other candidates out there, where if you're thinking about how you achieve accessibility in your city, the strategy you go for, you can end up going in lots of different directions. But this policy has the benefit of being so well defined and practical that we could see it being implemented relatively quickly. Nothing in the city is fast, but relatively quickly. Not to say it'll be easy, but we could see it happening, and it has that tangibility as well, as a tangible solution that gets you along that journey. Thirdly, because it leverages public procurement, it has this potential to have just a massive impact, and that impact actually extends, obviously with in the public sector and in local city services, but also beyond that. If we can actually shift the market, because public sector has its problems, but I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of should we say, websites, digital services are still not accessible enough, and so we can actually shift the dial, that bigger picture. And fourthly, just to finish off the this question, that this is a foundational policy. If you ask cities whether or not they're doing this, they think that they're doing it, and then they check, and then they're actually not. And so they should be doing it. They know they should be doing it, but our research shows that they're not. And there's a big gap which our research with our member cities has uncovered, which if we have time we can go into in more detail a bit further on in the discussion.
Yeah, Rushi, thank you for bringing up that research. I think for those of us who have been working in technology and accessibility, I think that research validates some of our own research at G3ICT and just experience that with policies in general around inclusion and accessibility, that it's one thing to have a policy, it's another thing to be actually implementing that policy consistently and across departments. And so great that you guys focus there. And I think also, Rushi, your recognition at the forum that there's already a track record of doing this kind of procurement at the national level of governments. And so what the forum allowed us to do with an expert team is sort of tweak that existing procurement policies and make them relevant for cities and how they buy technology. So thank you for the opportunity for those remarks. Federico, UCLG, your organization is really the convening place for cities around the world. And I know you're advancing a lot of really important topics to cities and people that live in those cities and run those cities. Can you talk a little bit more, building on what you said in your introduction, about what UCLG thinks about issues of equity and accessibility and inclusion and why they're so important today?
Well, I mean, I really feel like it's for local governments, it's in some ways quite simple, although it's hard. It's that aspect of really wanting the city to represent the people who actually live there. And I think furthermore that we go on, we know more with data and also different interactions that we have, such as social media platforms. We know more about the people who are actually utilizing the services or not being able to utilize the services that we have. And I wanted to kind of echo and also kind of applaud the cities I mentioned before, like Los Angeles. I think One thing you mentioned was that cross-departmental connection. I wanted to say that that's a really hard step. So kind of applaud yourself for being able to bring together these departments, because a lot of what we see too in terms of equity and access, they tend to be topics that are really difficult to mobilize different departments around. And so just having a window there that really brings together different departments on a common issue to see it as a common good and resilient. And then the other thing that why it's so important is equity and access, something that we knew before, but is really key to the public service delivery as a core component of that. And I think as we build out how we're going to deliver out services and how they're going to reach people, it has to take a equity and a human rights-based approach, really looking at, I think, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities provides a really good framework in the general comment on Article 9 that really can go into how public service delivery needs to get there. And we look at the common benefits of accessibility, even for groups that are traditionally not associated with people with disabilities, such as people coming into a city with limited knowledge of the local language, and technology can be a big driver there, as well as we think about policies on migration that are more inclusive instead of integrating, but more really bringing into cities, really bringing in people to cities in a more inclusive way. And that change from integrating people, that integration model, which was kind of putting people into spaces that were already created inequitably, and changing to inclusive spaces that can be more co-designed and co-framed. So that's a lot of what we've been seeing, and our policy that we are working on now with our community of practice around accessibility. It was really led from civil society, and that's another thing I think that the focus of having public service delivery be more equitable is it also builds that trust in governance, and that government can really handle equity and with our civil society partners, and then building out the recommendations for us and what we needed to do and where we needed. The lens that we needed to be running was really important, and understanding that, it's not only about the next election, it's not only about how that mayor seen, but really the legacy of that city and the culture of that city or that region. What is it going to be left out? And a majority of or I could say all of our members, it's not that they want to exclude people. They are just trying to understand, how do I really create that roadmap forward? What are the steps that I need to take? And that's I think one of the things that's really nice about this policy is that it gives that roadmap, that step by step, which is really important, because sometimes depending on the size of the city or the capacity of the city, what they know about accessibility can be daunting. And it's really important to, one, provide those different let's say perspectives on whether it's regional or capacity wise on how people get started. And the other thing is knowing that it's a roadmap, like Stephen was saying from Los Angeles, there's so much to do, but they've already taken, I think one of the hardest steps is already putting it in there and making it an investment, a long-term investment, and also providing that resilience between different departments that's going to say, hey, we're going to work together on this. And this digital aspect is not only relevant in terms of digital development, but it's also relevant to how there's mixed mode that we're looking at, whether it's transportation, and that mix of now mobilities are not just going to be physical, but also incorporate digital information into getting you to the next location. So that's why it's so important having this really part and parcel of what a core development principle is. And for us, accessibility is not a standalone topic. It's not a silo. It's a pillar for sustainability. It's a pillar for resilience, and it's a pillar for equity. So this is why we're working on it, and we're really putting in our resources and our time, and bringing in together both research, the learning aspects, which we hope that this can also be part of the learning for the community, and then those best practices. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Federico, for the work that you're doing at UCLG through your communities of practice. It's great to hear that work, that focus on inclusion and equity and accessibility is demand driven from within the cities. And I appreciate you also raising the important point about including civil society and disabled persons organizations in that work in cities, which is obviously a core principle that a lot of us share. In a little bit, we'll be hearing from Dr. Mohammed Lutfi at G3ICT, who's got a lot of experience with those organizations in the civil society sector in its approach to cities and technology and accessibility. So thank you so much, Federico. Ruthie, moving to you next. The other three folks in this section have introduced themselves, but we haven't heard from you. So maybe if you could just start and let us know a little bit about your role in the work of the IDC. And then I guess the question that I'd love to have you weigh in on is that we really do know that you in particular and your group at the IDC are recognized as leaders in defining and advancing smart cities. I know when I make decisions about smart city conferences, I often look to see if you'll be speaking there, because I appreciate the great work that you and IDC do. We also know that at IDC that you really see accessibility and inclusion as core to smart cities, much of what we've already started hearing today. So can you talk a little bit about why, from your perspective, accessibility and inclusion are core to the work that smart cities are doing?
Sure. Thank you, and happy Global Accessibility Day, everybody. Very exciting, and I'm excited to be here, so thank you so much. I'm Ruthie Yesner, so my quick introduction is I head up our government education and smart cities and communities group at IDC, and we're a market research firm that focuses on specifically technology, and so my role has always been research and advisory services to governments and to vendors that serve governments around the use of technology. And I'm mostly known because I started our smart cities and communities practice. And part of that was defining in the early stages, in 2010, what a smart city means. And I think when I was thinking about that, the first thing is, we're trying to make life better for everybody using technology. That's sort of the fundamental mission of smart cities. And government themselves, as we've heard from the cities, have a moral imperative. Their job is to serve the public. That includes everybody. So just baked into our definition was this idea that technology must serve everyone and be inclusive, and that's really the whole point. And often it was talked about in terms of the triple bottom line. Before, it was like environmental, social, and financial. Now we kind of talk about it as ESG. And within the S, there's a lot around digital inclusion. So that's really how we sort of the why of why we already looked at that. And I think the other is because these issues are actually related. So when you think about sustainability, economics, social issues, they are often coalesce around certain groups all together as big pressures. So you may be someone who has accessibility issues, who also might be hit hardest if there's a flood or a fire, or be most concerned about that. And you might also have more financial strain. So really, one of the ways we are looking at this more and more is that there's a lot of bang for your buck when you think of these things all together. And when you start to think of digital tools that can actually work all together. So I really loved what I think Los Angeles Stephen was saying around cross-departmental work, because that also applies, right? Public safety and transportation can be together thinking about sustainability issues and accessibility issues. The other thing I just wanted to say that I think is really important, and all of these things have been mentioned by everybody, so I'm just sort of emphasizing, I guess, really a lot of already terrific, amazing comments. But I think, the other thing we talk about in smart cities is civic engagement and human-centered design. So I think the other thing that becomes very important is representation. As you're starting to deliver services, there has to be representation from the public. We always say that with smart cities, right? You want to involve, but there has to be representation from different groups around accessibility and different people who have different disabilities. So I think that's very important as you're designing services, as you're thinking about the procurement, as you're thinking about policy implementation, that you really make sure that your, human-centered design is inclusive of all the humans. and sometimes I do feel like that's a little bit left out when we see some of the work. And I have a super quick story about that, and then I'll stop talking, but this was really enlightening for me. I was meeting with Dr. Panetta and Victor and James at World Smart Cities Expo years ago. And I was very concerned because all the little expo areas were on this little raised lip. And I had spent the day being like, don't trip over and fall on your face on these little lips because you're gonna look like an idiot. But then I realized in talking to Victor, who's in a wheelchair, like he can't even go onto the expo floor. He couldn't get into most of the exhibits because of this lip. And so I think, you know, it becomes really important to have inclusion. The last thing I just wanted to say was specifically about technology, which is what we're all here for. As Rushi and a lot of people have said, is that, you know, there's work to be done in making sure technology is inclusive. We can move the markets as governments by having procurement policies that are accessible. We've already said that there's massive spending power. So you can really actually drive an accessible market and accessible services by having, you know, these things embedded in procurement. But I think the other thing that's really important is to think about that there's so much opportunity with technology itself. Voice activation, the transcription services we're using, video with our interpreter, even automation, even digitizing physical assets in the city, which we talk about all the time in smart cities. These are all really important ways to really think about technology that can be really supportive for a lot of people. So I'll stop now. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really enjoying the conversation.
Rupi, thank you so much for your remarks. It really is great to see a leading mainstream smart city group that really defines what it means to be smart, having this interconnected focus on usability and accessibility. It really helps all of our work, frankly, as a civil society organization, to have you out there championing and helping people to see the connection between inclusion and being a smart city. You mentioned the big Smart City Expo in Barcelona that usually happens every year. I remember that 3 or 4 years ago, I think it was, and at that same show, I walked around to probably 100 booths. These are smart city solutions providers, all really exciting. One of them knew whether or not their solution that they were selling to cities was accessible and worked for the city employees and citizens with disabilities, just one. In later years, I've noticed more, so that's good. But this model policy that the G20 has come up with is really to help drive industry to put more focus on inclusion and accessibility of the smart solutions that they're selling to cities. And so thank you for raising that show. And Laura, that's a great segue to you. Microsoft is a leading global technology vendor. You yourself are an expert on accessibility policies and standards like the G20 model procurement policy. Can you talk a little bit about why you think this policy is a good opportunity for cities?
Absolutely. As James mentioned, I've been working on technology policy and accessibility with Microsoft for many, many years. And procurement is very powerful. It's something I'm really passionate about. And I want to kind of bring the conversation back to the why. I mean, one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about procurement and that Microsoft and a lot of my industry colleagues is because it's the way we get this fantastic accessible technology into the hands of people with disabilities who really need it. So if the city were to ask me, you know, why should I look at procurement? Why should I take the time and energy to put a policy like this in place? I would say, first of all, adding accessibility to your procurement policy is a proven inclusion strategy. So a lot of us in industry, we've been working with federal governments in the United States, in Canada, with the member states in Europe, the European Union, for many, many years. And they have policies and they work to buy technology that is accessible through these policies so that they're better able to hire, accommodate, and retain people with disabilities in their workforces. And these same governments are also able to leverage the technology and the services to make their citizen services like access to justice, emergency services, and education more accessible, which has been critical, especially as of late with COVID. I think we've all been using technology a lot more during COVID. And then second of all, this policy, I mean, many governments, they've spent years crafting their policies. And because of the forum's model policy, which I was thrilled to help create, this model policy, it streamlines all of the best practices from all of the experiences of these federal and other governments have been doing it. All the best practices are in this template, and cities can tailor it if they want to, and then they can just put it into their existing procurement policy. And I recognize, as Stephen said, that's not necessarily an easy thing to do, but at least this model can help you get started. And the model policy in the appendix, it even includes example RFP language. So a city can take that language, pop it into their RFPs, and that lets vendors like Microsoft know that we need to include information about the accessibility of our products and services when we respond to that RFP. And then G3ICT has a lot of other resources for cities to leverage. Third, as industry folks, we have a lot of innovative accessibility features built into our technology and services, and we're ready to tell cities all about it. And we're ready to show you the accessibility features. But in order for that technology to get into the city so it can help people with disabilities, we need cities to ask us. We need them to put accessibility in their RFPs. We need them to ask us to do demos and to tell them about accessibility of our products. We have accessibility reports, and I'm talking about we in the big industry, we. A lot of us have accessibility reports that can help a city understand how our technology aligns with international accessibility standards. And as was, I think Rupia just said, we like to compete on accessibility because that helps drive more innovation into the market. And we know that innovation can help cities solve longstanding challenges that they've had. And then last, in my opinion, there's no better time than now to adopt a procurement policy that has accessibility criteria. Do it while your cities are undergoing their digital transformations, so that as you're acquiring technology for everyone, that technology is going to be inclusive and accessible. Historically, people with disabilities have left behind because accessibility has been an afterthought. But if cities make buying accessible technology part of their smart city objectives and integrate that into their plans and think about it as part of their digital transformation from the beginning, we won't leave people behind. Thanks, James.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for making what I think is one of the most exciting points in this conversation about inclusive cities and how cities buy technology, which is that you as companies, you as Microsoft, and I think you would say some of your competitors as well, you want to be asked about accessibility in what you're selling to cities. You want to compete with other companies based on the accessibility of your products and services and innovate on accessibility. And so hearing that from industry, I think is incredibly important. And the other piece that you mentioned that kind of echoes what Stephen had said as well is through a procurement policy, if you bake accessibility into what you're asking for as a city, what you're wanting to buy, you eliminate the risk of it being an afterthought, which is much more complicated and expensive to deal with if you just define it up front that we're looking for accessible technology. And as we'll hear in a minute, the model policy actually points to global standards that define what accessible means. So you as cities don't need to think about, well, what does that even mean? It's already been defined, and these standards are ready for you to use in your RFPs and tenders. So thank you, all of you, for that great discussion. What I'd like to do now is, Julia, if you could pull up the PowerPoint. I want to pull in a couple colleagues that we're working with to work with cities, Monica Duem and Mohammed Lutfi. I'll let them introduce themselves in just a minute. But what we'd like to do is present the model policy and the program where we're working with cities like LA and Quito and Istanbul called the Inclusive Procurement Launchpad project, where we're helping cities adopt the model policy. So I'll be joined by a couple other experts where we've all been working with Los Angeles initially on these issues. All of us have been in the accessibility field for a long, long time. And so I wanted to pull them in to help walk through why this policy is important and really what does it cover? What does it look like? And I'll ask Bella or one of my colleagues to make sure that if we haven't already, to put a link to the model policy. It's right on the World Economic Forum G20 website. You can see it there. So with that, if you want to go to the agenda slide, in this last segment here, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about this collaboration between G3ICT, G20, and the forum. Talk about why this procurement policy matters for cities. We've heard a lot about that already, including from the 3 cities earlier. Go through the main components of the model policy. Talk a little bit about this Launchpad program where we're providing expert technical assistance to cities in understanding and adopting the policy like we did with LA. And then have some time for any questions. So Julia, if you want to go to the team slide with the photos. So before we jump in, I do want to have my colleagues introduce themselves. Monica, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, James, and hello to everyone. I'm Monica Duem. I've been working for many years with G3ICT. I'm a founder of Her Colors, which is an organization that try to create capabilities on digital inclusion, mostly in Mexico and Latin America. Our main goal is really to awareness and creation of capabilities. As everyone said before, companies are aware of the importance of accessibility. Governments are starting working on accessibility, but we do believe that it is very important that vendors as well as companies understand what are the inclusion and universal accessibility criteria. In our countries in Latin America, to have the knowledge is so important because it also comes to costs. If we know what we're expecting, if we know what we have to ask for our vendors, we will create a technological environment that is inclusive and really eliminate the digital divide. And I think Federico already said it, it's not only persons with disabilities, but it's indigenous, it's the elderly. It's really a lot of persons that will need and needs today inclusive and accessible technology. And I will close with something that I think it's important. The Health Organization published a couple of years ago that close to 1 billion young people are at risk of hearing loss because of the use of unsafe listening and very high volumes. So imagine if we didn't have closed caption, 500 million young people wouldn't be able to interact with technology. So thank you very much, James.
Sure, Monica, great to have you. Thank you for joining us. And Mohammed, actually, before you introduce yourself, I do want to remind folks, if you have any questions, feel free to put them into the Q&A. Bella and Julia from our team are monitoring the Q&A section. Mohammed, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, James. Thank you for having me today. It's great to be here among colleagues and friends that some of them I've worked with in the past. My name is Mohammed Lutfi. I am G3ICT Director for Capacity Building and Advocacy. I joined G3ICT almost a year plus. I come with a background of disability advocacy on many levels and with regard to different sectors, including urban development and disability inclusion. I led alongside with our colleague, our friend, Dr. Victor Pineda, the stakeholder group of persons with disabilities to the Habitat 3 General Assembly of Partners. And I bring to the table the aspect of engaging with issues of accessibility and urban or urban development from the perspective of persons with disabilities and their organizations. Because as we might address later on, that it's very important for any work on smart cities, urban development, resilience, and so on and so forth, is to include persons with disabilities in their organizations, because they are the ones who are the most expert on their own needs before anything else. And this is, however, we need to also recognize that persons with disabilities and their organizations also need to develop some leadership skills to engage with policymakers on the level of urban development policies, and bring to the table what they want to see, knowing that, and I agree that with what other friends have said today, that seeing cities adopting policies on accessibility, especially in the realm of digital world, is not only beneficial for persons with disabilities, as other friends mentioned. So we are bringing to the table knowledge sharing, capacity building, advocacy efforts, enhancement by persons with disabilities and their organizations in this field of digital accessibility and urban development.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Yulia, if you could go to the next slide that shows the 5 model policies. As Rushi mentioned, they have worked with a bunch of different partners and experts around the world on their set of 5 model policies. G3ICT was the lead in developing this model policy for procurement of accessible technology. Laura Ruby and Monica were both a part of the expert team that developed that, along with several others. Yulia, if you want to go to the next slide. So we've heard a bit about the why of a procurement policy. We know that the digital world still is not accessible, that cities are buying and deploying technology, whether it's web development or mobile apps or smart solutions. The entire sectors, education sector, financial services, are using technology more and more, but that technology is not necessarily accessible for people with a range of disabilities. Another reason why we really focus on this issue of procurement is that we know that accessible technology really is core to supporting human and civil rights, ensuring legal compliance. We heard a little bit from Stephen in Los Angeles about risk and legal compliance. So accessibility really helps manage that kind of risk and make sure that cities are in compliance with laws and regulations in their country. But I think from my perspective, most importantly, why we focus on a procurement policy and our work with cities is that we know they work. We actually have decades of experience of national governments, like the US federal government, using these kinds of procurement policies where they put a requirement on themselves to buy only accessible technology. The US federal government has been doing it for more than 20 years. Other countries across the European Union in other parts of the world have similar policies at the national level. What we're doing here with the G20 is adapting those kinds of procurement policies for cities so that they can also be investing in deploying accessible technology. And the benefits, there's a lot of them. Obviously, if you're buying accessible technology, your public services will be more accessible to everyone in your city. We've really seen that these policies can create and drive a market, really change the industry to focus more on accessibility and inclusion in what they're innovating for technology solutions. And we heard some of that from Laura just a minute ago. I think one of the best employers of people with disabilities in the world is the US federal government. That is in part, I would say, because they only buy accessible technology. So if you are a person with a disability applying for a job there, you know that the technology will work for you. And Stephen also mentioned about the importance of accessible technology for employees with disabilities. We see in countries certainly that have a focus on accessibility and buying accessible technology, that there's really growth and support for the technology sector in general, and the accessibility part of that sector in particular. And really developing a local infrastructure of professionals who have expertise and tools that they can bring to accessibility and inclusion. So there's a lot of real good benefits of looking at and adopting a policy like this. Before we go to the next slide, Monica or Mohammed, any additional thoughts on kind of the why of a procurement policy?
Can I come in, James?
Sure, please.
I think procurement, the discussion on procurement and digital accessibility is a key step towards recognizing that inclusion of persons with disabilities in the field of smart cities or urban development in general is a matter of human rights, especially nowadays that we have 182 countries have ratified the CRPD, and the CRPD is an initial source, or like the main source on the rights of persons with disabilities, have recognized accessibility as one of the key principles to make sure that persons with disabilities have the right to inclusion in not only in technology, but also seeing that technology is a necessary step to ensuring that persons with disabilities have access to other sectors like education. And James, you brought up an excellent example on how the US federal government is one of the most inclusive employers for persons with disabilities in the world. And also other sources such as the Sustainable Development Goals with Goal 11 have recognized that. So in order to make sure that we have the proper infrastructure or the minimum infrastructure for inclusion for persons with disabilities in the field of digital technology, it's very important to recognize or like adopt procurement policy that would enable us to see that digital accessibility or smart cities are becoming inclusive, more and more inclusive for persons with disabilities, that we saw today with the 3 examples we have at this session.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Monica, anything before we actually skip ahead to the model policy itself?
Just to raise the questions and invite cities to think that what they're doing in cybersecurity, for example, and we've seen a lot of development in procurement towards cybersecurity and nothing on accessibility. So, I mean, if we're offering as a city a service using technology, we should think in our procurement as we're thinking on cybersecurity matters on accessibility, because all our services and products that we offer digitally or using technology are meant to be useful for everyone.
Great, thank you, Monica. Julia, if you could just skip ahead, I think, to the actual model policy slide. I'd like for us to just touch on the aspects of this model policy to give people a better sense of what they might be advocating their city to adopt. I think we mentioned that the drafting of this model policy really leveraged decades of experience with similar policies at the national level of government. As we drafted this version for cities, we tried to streamline it a bit, make it as straightforward as possible, but also as complete as possible, as we brought in these decades, as Laura mentioned, of experience, and that's all baked into this model policy. The goal was to create a policy that a city could modify a bit and easily adopt relatively easily, just like LA has done, and just like we'll start working with Istanbul and Quito to do very soon. What we're showing on this slide is the core components in the model policy. Again, this is the entire policy is on the G20 website. But I'll briefly sort of tick through the main components. None of these component pieces are very long. It's a quite brief policy, but comprehensive. And so there's an introduction in the model policy that just sort of says this is the name of the policy and how it comes into effect. There's a set of objectives there where we think it's a good opportunity for a city to tie this procurement policy to other objectives it may have around closing the digital divide or economic development. That's an important opportunity there to make those linkages and really demonstrate the city's commitment to accessibility and inclusion. Section 3 of the model policy importantly defines the roles and responsibilities. It specifically names what city department or person is or unit is in charge of promoting the and implementing and importantly enforcing the implementation of the model policy of buying accessible technology. And remember that the policy itself is on the city. The requirement is on the city, not on the vendors. It's just a requirement that cities put on themselves to say, when we buy technology, when we put out tenders, we will reference accessibility as a requirement. Just like, as Monica was saying, just like security is important in our technology purchases, privacy is, so is accessibility. The next section actually really begins to be quite important because we're talking about standards for the first time. This is a brief section and it's just an explicit statement that accessibility will be required as an attribute of procurement of technology, of ICT. And it points to a relevant global ICT accessibility standard. And we list 3 of those standards. They're fantastic standards, and we list 3 of them in the annex of the policy. And here, again, I want to emphasize that the standards work is largely done. Cities don't need to create a new standard. The standards exist. They've been worked on for years and years, and they're very robust and used around the world. And they really do define what it means for every kind of technology to be accessible for different types of disability. The next part of the model policy is the preparatory study. City procurement departments are doing these preparatory studies as part of their procurement of technology systems and solutions. And here, this part of the policy is just saying that accessibility, when appropriate, should be a part of those preparatory studies when a city is getting ready to invest in technology. Section 6 deals with, again, with the use of standards and making sure that in the mandatory requirements that are part of tenders, that the procurement authority for the city refers to these global standards specifically in the annex. This part of the model policy also says that lead agency or department should keep current on these ICT accessibility standards. They are standards and technologies evolve, and so it's important to stay current with the standards. Section 7 deals with conformance. How do suppliers demonstrate that they are meeting, conforming to, meeting these requirements for accessibility? The model policy itself lists different approaches to supplier conformance, including what I would say is the most common approach, which is a supplier self-declaration of conformance. Stephen mentioned VPATs. These are ways that companies can show for different products and services how they are meeting accessibility standards. Section 8 talks about contract management and how the procurement agency should verify throughout the life of the contract accessibility and meeting accessibility requirements. Section 9 of the model policy is about exemptions. Maybe there are some types of technology purchases that you would want to exempt from this policy. I think, Stephen, as we worked through it in Los Angeles, that we really didn't necessarily define any exemptions, but that's part of the consideration. Section 10 of the policy deals with some of what we've heard around role-based training, that effective implementation will require some training for procurement officials, for IT professionals in the city, and making sure that that's accounted for. Section 11 talks about how you as a city would monitor how effectively the policy is being implemented. I often point to a university here in the United States, Georgia Tech University. They know that 80% of their procurements reference accessibility standards, and they track that across multiple departments at the university. So 11 talks about that kind of monitoring. And then finally, Section 12 calls for a periodic review. Every 2 years, we suggest looking at the policy and updating it if needed. At the end of the policy, the model policy, you'll see there's an appendix with 3 really important things there. There's, as Laura mentioned, there's actual sample language that you could use in your tenders. It's pretty simple and straightforward. There's also definitions. We sort of source different definitions for accessibility and disability from global documents from the UN and other organizations. And then there's also the 3 standards, which I've mentioned. So that's the policy by design. It's meant to be really straightforward and impactful. Monica and Mohammed, any thoughts, clarifications that you'd like to add to the policy itself and the components of the policy? Monica? Go ahead, Mohammed.
No, well, just very quickly, James, I would like to again emphasize the idea of engaging with persons with disabilities at all stages of procurement, whether in terms of planning or determining principles or strategies. Also to make sure that persons with disabilities are consulted as end users to make sure that whatever we procure for digital accessibility in smart cities is working for them. And I think, for example, Microsoft and with the great products it has and adopting standards of accessibility there is a good example, because we see how persons with disabilities are really able to benefit from these softwares. And so engaging with persons with disabilities and their organizations is very important. And we have to make sure that when we talk about procurement for digital accessibility, we're not just talking about one, like a disability as a block of population. It's very diverse. We have to take into consideration needs of all these groups of persons with disabilities, whether deaf or hard of hearing or blind or physical disabilities. And as we see, and we heard from colleagues today, like Steve from LAA or from Laura, Microsoft, how digital accessibility is not beneficial, and Federico, of course, that digital accessibility and smart cities, inclusive smart cities, is not beneficial only for persons with disability, but for all people.
Really great points. I think where we've seen governments of all kinds, but certainly cities be really effective, and even companies, is how they engage the disability community as part of sourcing and developing technology. One of the great examples that I often point to is the city of Chicago, where their commissioner for people with disabilities, their IT department and CIO worked really closely together to make sure that a new digital 311 system was accessible for people with disabilities. And so throughout that process, including procurement, but also user testing, they made sure that people with disabilities were involved in the process. Monica, anything you'd like to add relevant to the policy?
People with disability, not only as users, but as co-workers as well, we need to understand what are their needs. And finally, I think that the model, as you can see, it really covers a whole bunch of aspects in how to implement the policy. And tell cities not to be discouraged if they read the standards for the first time. They can be complicated, but it's like a learning curve. And once you understand the barriers and how people with different capabilities really, what are their barriers and how they serve and use technology, they will come much easier.
Fantastic. Mohammed, I'll come right back to you in just a second. I want to make sure that, Julia, if you can go to the Launchpad slide, the next slide, just mention, we've talked a little bit about how G3 ICT is working with cities. We've completed our work with the city of Los Angeles for now. We'll be starting work with Quito and Istanbul to work with them to understand and adopt this model policy. We have an Inclusive Procurement Launchpad project where we're helping cities adopt the model policy. Microsoft has actually funded us very generously to work with these cities and provide technical assistance. We sort of source expert teams to work with each city and different departments in the city to understand the model policy. We have an initial cohort of 6 cities. 3 of those slots are taken by LA and Quito and Istanbul, but we're talking to other cities about partnering to help them adopt this model policy too. And so if you're interested, please do reach out to me and Julia and Bella. Mohammed, did you want to jump in?
Just very quickly, James, I would like to build on what Monica said, that we need to look at inclusive smart cities for persons with disabilities as something that is, again, beneficial for all, not only from a perspective of bureaucratic, and institutional arrangements or legal commitment, but also as a business model. And we can tell, like, from the outcomes of adopting procurement for inclusion of persons with disabilities in urban settings, how this is beneficial for different stakeholders, including governments, private sector companies, and of course, people in general. So the business model is very key strategy to motivate or encourage stakeholders to adopt this model.
Absolutely. Thank you for emphasizing that, Mohammed. Before we close out, I do want to just see if any of our speakers from the cities or the previous panels, any last thoughts that any of you would like to share? Stephen? You're on mute. There you go.
Hi, thank you. I just, I want to sort of double down on one of Mohammed's comments around user testing. We say that, it gets said a lot, but I don't think people take it seriously enough. Where we have organized accessibility, like interpreters or captioning, the user testing world just isn't organized at that level, and we even have shortages of interpreters, especially trilingual interpreters. And so I think there's so much build out that still needs to get done, and I hope that our private sector partners and the public sector teams can really work together to develop ways to help people get into the training to be interpreters and user testers formally, and that we find ways to really bump up that game. I can't stress it enough. User testing is one of the biggest gaps, I think, around broad accessibility.
Yeah, really good point. And from the sort of the front lines there, Stephen, thank you for sharing that. Federico, did you want to make some closing remarks?
No, yeah, just want to say really shortly. I mean, I think it's been said, but just really drive home that point that, accessibility is not only anything that you have to do, but it also allows us to think way more innovatively about our policies. And it's something that I just want to drive home, and it's something so much that we're talking about in the community of practice and the training we do, is that innovation that's from accessibility, in that way that it's just changes what's kind of this monotonous way of designing policies or implementing the service delivery. It allows you to think so much more differently and provide that framework to actually having a city that honors diversity. And yeah, I just wanted to drive that home, that connection, accessibility, innovation.
Thank you, Federico, for making that point in connection and for your role. Ruth B, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you. I thought this was great, and everyone said everything that I agree with, and I was really interesting. And I just wanted to say too, a lot of times just around the innovation and inclusion that Mohammed was talking about, and also the user testing, is that, there's just, the more diversity there is, the better the outcomes. That's been proven, right? So you have women leaderships, all of a sudden they find that there's more creativity and there's better solutions and higher performance. So, even just in a practical way, everybody is better off when the participants are diverse. And I think, we should just sort of remember that as kind of a proven way the world works when we're trying to collaborate.
Yeah, and it's great, Ruth B, when multiple organizations, different kind of organizations like IDC, G3ICT, UCLG, the Forum, Microsoft are all sort of delivering that message together. I think it becomes much more compelling. I think someone from Quito would like to add some remarks, please.
Hi, well, I just wanted to say thank you for this space. We're looking forward to start this learning process with you all and the cities that have more experience in this. In Quito, we're leading this process in the country, in Ecuador, and we are willing to start this process with here in the Secretariat of Mobility with the Technology Department. So thank you again for the space, and looking forward to start this learning process.
Thank you so much. We're really excited to be working with you in Istanbul next as well in adopting the model policy. So with that, I want to say thank you to all of the speakers and to Bella and Yulia on the G3ICT team for setting this up and making sure it runs smoothly. I'd like to thank the sign language interpreter as well. I know she had some kind of double duty because her colleague was ill. So we appreciate that. And I'll just mention that I believe Bella has been putting resources into the chat. The great news is that with policies like this, there's an enormous amount of tools and good practices and resources already available. So you're not doing this sort of work in a vacuum. You've got a lot of experience to build on. So I would encourage you to reach out and check that out as well. Thank you all very much for joining us. We'll be posting this recording if you want to share it with colleagues and direct them to it. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.